Nobody in this room thought he could understand a single word they said. They were wrong. For 4 days, he called them invisible. For 4 days, this single dad said nothing at all. Then he set down the glass. And everything in that room changed in 1 second. Mr. Richter, I understand every word you're saying. Every single one. He wasn't just fluent in German. He was fluent in dignity. And tonight, the whole world would learn his name.
If you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever been looked at like you were invisible, like your presence in a room was an inconvenience rather than a person, then this story is for you. Stay with me until the end, because what this single father does in the next few minutes will give you chills. And if stories about quiet dignity, hidden strength, and the moment an ordinary man refuses to be small ever again mean something to you, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because you will not want to miss what happens next. Daniel Cole had exactly $11 in his checking account and a 7-year-old daughter who believed, with her whole heart, that her father could fix anything. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of gray New York morning where the sky looked like it hadn't decided whether to rain, and Daniel stood in the small kitchen of their Queens apartment, pouring the last of the cereal into a bowl and topping it off with slightly too much milk to make it look like more than it was. "Daddy, is this the good cereal or the sale cereal?" Lily asked, swinging her feet under the table, her 2 front teeth still growing in, giving her smile a gap that made Daniel's chest ache every time he saw it, because it reminded him so much of her mother. "It's the excellent cereal," Daniel said, kissing the top of her head. "Only the finest oats for my favorite person in the whole world." She giggled, and for a moment, the weight Daniel carried, the unpaid electric bill sitting on the counter, the second job he hadn't found yet, the gnawing fear that he was failing at the one thing that mattered most, lifted just slightly, just enough to get him through another day. 3 years ago, Daniel Cole had been someone else entirely. He had a doctorate in progress, half finished, in comparative linguistics from a university in Berlin, a wife named Elena who filled every room she entered with laughter, and a future that looked, from the outside, absolutely golden. Elena was German, a translator for the EU, and Daniel had met her in a used bookstore in Charlottenburg during a semester abroad that turned into 4 years, a marriage, and a daughter born in a hospital overlooking the Spree River. He learned her language not from textbooks, but from her, from late-night arguments about politics, from bedtime stories she insisted on telling Lily in German so she would grow up, knowing both halves of who she was, from the small, tender words spoken only between 2 people who trust each other completely. Then came the diagnosis: aggressive, fast-moving, merciless. 14 months from the day Elena felt the first strange fatigue to the day Daniel held her hand in a hospital room in Berlin and watched the woman who had built his entire world slip away from him. He was 31 years old, a widower, and a single father to a 4-year-old girl, standing in a foreign country with a half-finished dissertation that suddenly meant nothing at all. He brought Lily home to New York because his mother was there, because he needed something familiar, because Berlin had become a city made entirely of memories he could not walk past without breaking. The dissertation was abandoned. The academic career he had been building evaporated, because grief does not care about tenure tracks. What mattered was rent, and diapers, and later, school shoes, and always, keeping a roof over his daughter's head. He took the first job he could find that paid enough, and asked few questions about gaps in a resume, valet and floor captain at the Meridian Grand, a 5-star hotel in Midtown Manhattan that catered to the kind of wealth Daniel used to only read about in newspapers. He wore a navy uniform with gold buttons and a brass nameplate that read D. Coal, and he opened car doors and carried luggage and refilled water glasses for people who had never once, in 3 years, asked him his name. He did not tell anyone at the Meridian Grand about the doctorate. He did not tell them he spoke fluent German, passable French, and enough Mandarin to get by. To his colleagues, he was simply Daniel, reliable, quiet, always early, always the one who volunteered for the shifts nobody else wanted because he needed the overtime. His manager, a sharp, tired woman named Priya Anand, liked him because he never complained and never made mistakes. She had no idea that the man restocking the champagne bucket in the East Wing could have been teaching graduate seminars in comparative morphology. Daniel liked it that way. Invisibility, he had learned, could be a kind of armor. Nobody expects anything from the man who blends into the wallpaper, and after Elena, Daniel had wanted, more than anything, to not be seen, to just get through each day, get home to Lily, read her a chapter of whatever book they were working through, and collapse into a few hours of dreamless sleep before doing it again. The morning at the cereal bowl was, in hindsight, the last ordinary morning before everything changed. He dropped Lily at school, rode the subway 40 minutes into Manhattan, and clocked in at the Meridian Grand at 9 sharp, same as always. Nothing about the day suggested it would be different from the 1100 days that preceded it. There was a note on the staff board. VIP arrival, suite 4001, the Richter party. Extreme discretion required. Daniel had seen 100 notes like it. Billionaires, minor royalty, tech founders. The Meridian Grand collected them like other hotels collected loyalty points. Klaus Richter arrived at 11:40 in a motorcade of 3 black SUVs, trailed by an entourage of assistants, a personal chef, 2 security men built like refrigerators, and a nervous-looking junior executive clutching a tablet like it contained the nuclear codes. Richter himself was a compact, silver-haired man in his early 60s, Austrian-German by birth, the founder and chairman of Richter Industrialogistik, a shipping and freight conglomerate worth some $11 billion. He was, Daniel knew from the whispers among the Bell staff, notoriously difficult, the kind of man who fired assistants for bringing him the wrong brand of sparkling water. Daniel was assigned to the Richter party for the week. It was considered a plum assignment among the valets, because VIP guests tipped well when they tipped at all. Daniel needed the money too badly to care about Richter's reputation. For 3 days, it was uneventful. Daniel carried bags, opened doors, stood silently in elevators, while Richter barked into his buys about tariffs and shipping lanes. Richter never looked at him, not once. Daniel might as well have been a fixture bolted to the hallway. There was a rhythm to those 3 days that Daniel had come to know well over the years. A rhythm shared by nearly every ultra-wealthy guest who passed through the Meridian Grand. Wake at 6 for a workout with a private trainer flown in from Munich. Breakfast delivered precisely at 7:15, never a minute later. Always sparkling water, imported from a specific spring in the Alps. Never the sparkling water the hotel actually stocked. Calls until noon. A lunch nobody finished. More calls. A dinner that was really just another meeting, with better lighting. Daniel had learned to read these men and women the way he once read syntax trees in graduate. Seminars, patterns within patterns. A grammar of entitlement that repeated itself with only cosmetic variation from guest to guest. Richter followed the pattern almost exactly, except for one detail that stuck with Daniel. Every evening around 9, Richter would stand alone on his suite's balcony for exactly 4 minutes, phone in hand, scrolling to a single photograph he never posted, never shared, never spoke about. Daniel noticed it only because he was often nearby, restocking the minibar or turning down the bed, and he recognized something in the older man's posture during those 4 minutes, a stillness that looked less like billionaire boredom and more like grief or something adjacent to it. Daniel knew that posture. He had stood in it himself many nights, staring at photographs of Elena until his eyes burned. He didn't know, then, that the photograph belonged to a granddaughter Richter hadn't spoken to in 2 years. He only knew that for 4 minutes each evening, the world's most difficult guest looked, briefly, like a man who had lost something he couldn't get back, and Daniel, against his better judgment, had almost begun to feel a flicker of sympathy for him. That flicker would very nearly extinguish itself completely by Friday evening. On the 4th day, everything changed. It was a Friday evening, and Richter was hosting a small private reception in the Meridian's Fares Orchid Room for a group of investors he was courting for a new terminal expansion in Rotterdam. Daniel was stationed near the service entrance, restocking a cart of champagne flutes, close enough to the main room to hear the murmur of conversation, but positioned, as staff were trained to be functionally invisible. Richter was in a foul mood. The Rotterdam deal, Daniel gathered from the tense German being spoken between Richter and his chief financial officer, a stern woman named Ilse Brandt, was not going well. A regulatory hurdle had emerged that afternoon, and Richter suspected, correctly as it would turn out, that a rival conglomerate had leaked information to the Dutch regulators to sabotage the deal. Diese amerikanischen Idioten verstehen gar nichts von echtem Geschäft, Richter snapped at Brandt, swirling a glass of scotch. These American idiots understand nothing about real business. He said it without lowering his voice, without even glancing toward the staff moving quietly around the room's edges, because in his mind, the staff were not people capable of comprehension. They were furniture with legs. Brandt murmured something in response, and Richter continued, more venomously now, gesturing vaguely toward the room, toward the hotel, toward the entire concept of America. Und dieses Hotel, sieh dir diese Bedienung an, dressiert wie Affen im Zirkus, für ein paar Dollar Trinkgeld. Man muss ihnen ja nicht mal danken. Sie verstehen sowieso nicht, was man sagt. And this hotel, look at this staff, trained like circus monkeys, for a few dollars in tips. You don't even need to thank them. They don't understand what you're saying anyway. And Daniel's hands did not stop moving. He kept arranging the champagne flutes in their neat rows, his face perfectly still, the same practiced blankness he wore every single day. But inside his chest, something old and sharp had woken up. He thought of Elena, of the years he had spent learning to love a language so completely that he dreamed in it sometimes. He thought of the doctorate he never finished, the seminars he never taught, the version of himself who used to stand in front of rooms explaining the elegant architecture of German, syntax, to students who hung on every word. Richter wasn't finished. His eyes had drifted, almost lazily, toward Daniel, not seeing him, exactly, but using him as a prop for his point. He gestured at Daniel with his Scotch glass. Sieh dir diesen hier an. Bestimmt kann kaum lesen. Wahrscheinlich hat nicht mal eine Ausbildung. Menschen wie sind dafür da, Menschen wie uns zu dienen. Das ist die natürliche Ordnung der Dinge. Look at this one. He probably can barely read. Probably doesn't even have an education. People like him exist to serve people like us. That's the natural order of things. At that exact moment, Richter's phone, which he had been gesturing with, slipped from his other hand and clattered to the marble floor, screen up. The lock screen photo displayed brightly for a half second before he snatched it back up. A photo, Daniel would later learn, of Richter's own estranged granddaughter, a girl about Lily's age, whom Richter hadn't spoken to in 2 years after a falling out with his son. But it wasn't the phone that made Daniel move. It was the word dienen, to serve, spoken with such contempt, such casual cruelty, about a group of human beings Richter had not bothered to look at even once in 4 days. It was the echo of every person who had ever decided, on sight, what Daniel was and wasn't capable of. Daniel set down the champagne flute he was holding. He straightened his jacket, and in clear, precise, unmistakably fluent German, the German of someone who had lived and loved and grieved in that language, he spoke. Herr Richter, ich verstehe jedes Wort, das Sie sagen. Mr. Richter, I understand every word you're saying. The room did not just go quiet. It went still. In the particular way a room goes still when something has physically shifted in the air. Ilse Brandt's glass paused halfway to her lips. The junior executive with the tablet actually gasped audibly. Richter turned, slowly, his silver eyebrows drawing together in confusion, as if the champagne card itself had spoken. Daniel continued, his voice calm, measured, devastatingly polite, the voice of a man who had spent years learning that the sharpest response is often the quietest one. Ich habe einen Doktortitel in vergleichender Sprachwissenschaft begonnen an der Humboldt-Universität, bevor meine Frau, eine Deutsche, aus Charlottenburg, an Krebs gestorben ist und ich meine Tochter allein großziehen musste. Ich arbeite hier, weil ich Rechnungen bezahlen muss, nicht weil ich unfähig bin zu lesen. I began a doctorate in comparative linguistics at Humboldt University before my wife, a German woman, from Charlottenburg, died of cancer, and I had to raise my daughter alone. I work here because I have bills to pay, not because I am incapable of reading. He let that sit for a moment before he continued, switching effortlessly back to English so that everyone else in the room, the investors, the hotel staff, the junior executive, could understand exactly what had just happened. I've listened to you insult the staff of this hotel for 4 days, Mr. Richter. I've carried your bags and refilled your water and said nothing, because that is my job, and I take my job seriously, even when the person I'm serving does not extend me the same respect. But you called us monkeys. You said we don't deserve to be thanked. My daughter is 7 years old, and she thinks I hung the moon, and I am not going to stand here and let you talk about people like me, like her father, as though we're subhuman, in a language you assumed I couldn't understand. For a long, suspended moment, nobody in the orchid room moved. Ilse Brandt had gone pale. One of the investors, an older man from Rotterdam who, it would later emerge, spoke fluent German himself and had understood every word Richter said, had simply been too polite or too intimidated to object, set down his glass and began, very slowly, to clap. Just once, twice. A third investor joined him. Richter's face had gone through several colors, settling finally on a deep, furious red. Sie sind gefeuert, he snapped. You're fired. Then, catching himself, switching to English as though the language itself might reassert his authority. You're fired. Get the manager. This man is finished. That's not your call to make, Mr. Richter, said a voice from the doorway. It was Priya Anand, the floor manager, who had come to check on the reception and had arrived in time to hear the last 30 seconds of the confrontation, and who, it turned out, had a cousin who worked security in the hotel and had already sent her a text with a shaky video of the whole exchange, because half the waitstaff near the service door had their phones out the moment Daniel started speaking German. What none of them knew, in that frozen moment in the orchid room, was that the video, 11 seconds of Daniel Cole, calmly informing a furious German billionaire that he understood every word, was already being sent from one phone to another, and within the hour, it would leave the Meridian Grand entirely. Priya did not fire Daniel. She could not have, even if she'd wanted to. By the time she reached her office, corporate had already called twice, and the second call was not to ask what disciplinary action would be taken against the valet. It was to ask whether the hotel had a public relations statement prepared, because a video with the caption, "Single Dad Silences Billionaire in Flawless German," had accumulated 400,000 views in 90 minutes and was climbing. By midnight, it had 2 million. By the time Daniel picked Lily up from his mother's apartment, exhausted and still faintly shaking from adrenaline, Unaware of any of this, the clip was on 3 continents. Someone had subtitled it in Portuguese. A German news outlet had picked it up under the headline, "Vier Tage lang verstanden. Jetzt spricht er." Understood for 4 days, now he speaks. A Rotterdam business journalist, the same man who had clapped in the Orchid Room, wrote a scathing column the next morning about the culture of contempt inside Richter, Industria Logistic, quoting Richter's exact words back to him in translation for an international audience, including the very investors he'd been trying to court. The fallout for Richter was immediate and brutal. The Rotterdam terminal deal, already shaky, collapsed within 48 hours, as 2 of the 3 investors in that room publicly withdrew, citing concerns about corporate culture and leadership judgment. Richter Industria Logistics stock dropped 6% in a single trading session, a company built on decades of careful reputation management, undone in the time it took an 11-second video to travel around the world. Board members who had tolerated Richter's temper for years because the company's profits had always covered for his personality suddenly found their patience gone now that the personality was costing them money. In the hours after the confrontation, before any of the corporate calls or viral numbers meant anything to him, Daniel sat alone in the small break room behind the kitchen, still in his uniform, hands shaking slightly around a paper cup of coffee he wasn't really drinking. He kept replaying the look on Richter's face, not the anger, which he'd expected, but the split second of pure confusion that came first. The look of a man whose entire operating assumption about the world had just cracked down the middle. Daniel had spent 3 years building a wall of quiet invisibility around himself, brick by brick, shift by shift, because invisibility had felt safer than being seen and found wanting, safer than being asked questions about the life he used to have and couldn't bear to talk about. And in 11 seconds, without planning it, without deciding to, he had torn the whole wall down. He didn't know yet whether he'd regret it. He only knew that for the first time in 3 years, he had said something to a room full of strangers, using every part of who he actually was, instead of the small, careful, forgettable part he let the world see. It felt less like anger, sitting there in that break room, and more like breathing after holding his breath for a very long time. Daniel, meanwhile, was simply trying to survive a Saturday. He woke to 43 missed calls and a phone so overwhelmed with notifications it had frozen entirely. Priya called him personally to explain, gently, that he was not in trouble, quite the opposite, and that corporate wanted to meet with him Monday morning, though she wasn't entirely sure yet whether that meeting would be about a promotion or a lawsuit, because Richter's lawyers had spent the morning threatening the hotel with legal action for reputational damage, a threat that evaporated by noon once it became clear that suing a foreknown, grieving single father who had done nothing but tell the truth would only pour more gasoline on a creed's fire that was already consuming Richter's public image. What Daniel did not expect, and what moved him more than anything else that followed, was Lily's reaction. She found the video on her tablet Saturday afternoon. An older cousin had shown her, thinking it was funny, and she watched it 4 times in a row, her small face serious and intent, before she looked up at her father with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life. "Daddy, you talked like Mommy," she said. Daniel had to leave the room for a minute after that. The Monday meeting turned out to be neither a promotion in the traditional sense nor a lawsuit. It was something Daniel never could have predicted. The Meridian Grand's parent company, Halcyon Hospitality Group, operated 11 luxury properties across 4 countries, and their VP of International Guest Relations, a woman named Corinne Vasquez, who had built her career on exactly the kind of cross-cultural diplomacy the video had accidentally showcased, sat across from Daniel in a glass conference room and asked him a question nobody had asked him in 3 years. "Mr. Cole, "What did you actually study?" Daniel told her. "All of it. Humboldt University, comparative linguistics, the 4 languages, the unfinished dissertation, Elena, Berlin." The reason he'd stopped. Corinne listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she slid a folder across the table. It was an offer not to be a valet anymore, but to join Halcyon's newly forming International Guest Relations Division as a language and cultural liaison, working directly with VIP clientele across the company's European and North American properties at a salary that made Daniel actually laugh out loud in the meeting, not from joy at first, but from the sheer disbelief that 3 years of carrying luggage could end in a room like this. "We've needed someone like you for years," Corinne told him. "We just didn't know it until Friday." The story could have ended there, a tidy corporate redemption arc, and it would have been enough. But there was one more chapter, and it belonged to Klaus Richter. 3 weeks after the video, Richter Industrial Logistics Board forced a leadership review. Not a firing, not yet, but a humiliating public accountability process that required Richter to undergo what the board's statement carefully called executive communication and cultural competency coaching. The financial press had a field day, but it was what happened privately that mattered more. Richter requested a meeting with Daniel, through Corinne, through lawyers, through every formal channel available to a man used to getting what he wanted. He asked to see him. Daniel almost said no. He had every right to, but he thought about the phone that had fallen from Richter's hand in the orchid room, the photo of the granddaughter he hadn't spoken to in 2 years, and something in Daniel, the same something that had learned through unbearable loss that people are rarely only the worst thing they've ever said, made him agree. They met in a quiet cafe near the Meridian Grand. No cameras, no assistants. Richter looked smaller outside his silver and glass boardrooms, older, more uncertain. He did not perform an elaborate apology. He simply said, in German, that he had spent 61 years assuming that people who served him were beneath his notice, and that 4 days of not noticing Daniel Cole had cost him more than he could calculate. Not the stock price, not the Rotterdam deal, but something he hadn't realized he'd lost until it was gone. "Meine Enkelin," Richter said quietly, "my granddaughter. Ich habe sie 2 Jahre lang nicht gesehen, weil ich zu stolz war, mich zu entschuldigen. Ihre Tochter hat mich das gelehrt, dass Stolz einen am Ende ganz allein zurücklässt. I haven't seen her in 2 years, because I was too proud to apologize. Your daughter taught me that pride leaves you completely alone in the end." Daniel didn't offer easy forgiveness, because that wasn't his to give on behalf of every valet, every waiter, every invisible worker Richter had ever spoken over. But he told Richter something his own grief had taught him, that the people we dismiss as unimportant are very often carrying entire worlds inside them, and that the cost of not noticing is always higher than we think, until the day it's too late to pay it back. Richter called his son that week. 6 weeks later, in a small, unremarkable moment that made no headlines at all, he saw his granddaughter for the first time in 2 years. At a birthday party he almost didn't get invited to. Priya Anand, for her part, kept a printed still frame from the video pinned above her desk for years afterward, not of Richter's furious face, but of the moment just before, when Daniel set down the champagne flute and straightened his jacket, a full second before he said a single word. That's the part people forget, she liked to tell new hires during orientation. He decided before he spoke. The speaking was easy after that. Daniel Cole never became famous in the traditional sense. He didn't do the morning show circuit, though 3 networks asked. He gave one interview, brief and unglamorous, in which he said the only thing he really wanted people to understand, that dignity isn't something other people grant you. It's something you carry, whether or not anyone is paying attention, and that the moment someone tries to take it from you, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply, calmly, let them know that you were listening the entire time. Today, Daniel works out of Halcyon's New York office 3 days a week, with the flexibility to be home for Lily's school pickup on the other 2. He still speaks German every night, not out of obligation, but out of love. Bedtime stories, the same ones Elena used to tell, so that Lily will always know both halves of who she is. The apartment in Queens has a new refrigerator now, and the electric bill gets paid the day it arrives, instead of the day before the shutoff notice. Sometimes, late at night, after Lily is asleep, Daniel thinks about that 11-second clip, about how close he came to saying nothing at all, the way he had for 4 days, the way he had for 3 years. He thinks about how easy it would have been to stay invisible, to keep his head down, to let the moment pass like 1,000 moments before it. But he thinks too about Elena, about the language she gave him as a gift before she gave him a daughter to raise in it, and about the simple, unshakable truth that carried him through the worst grief of his life and into whatever came next, that being underestimated is not the same as being small, and that sometimes the most ordinary person in the room is the one carrying the most extraordinary story. You just have to give them the chance to speak. If this story moved you even a little, don't scroll away just yet. Drop a comment and let me know which part hit you hardest. Was it the cereal bowl? Was it you talked like mommy? Or was it the moment Daniel finally spoke? Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because there are so many more stories like this one still to come, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Thank you for watching until the very end. It means more than you know.